Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. So I've been wanting to make this video for a while now, and I started to write down my talking points, and I realized that I had a ton more to say than I initially anticipated. So I have to break this video up into a couple smaller ones, but the central theme over this video and the next few in this series is PTSD. I want to talk about it just because it's something that is a very real presence in my life. It has been for more than 10 years now, and in all this time that I've been living with PTSD, and a lot of people that I know have also been living with PTSD from our time in the military. It's not something that very many people really talk about or know much about. A lot of people that I've met, friends of mine, or people who are interested in hearing more about my story as a veteran, when it comes to talking about PTSD, they almost don't know what to think, or they've never really spoken to anyone about it. Something that is out there. You might read about it in a magazine or see little bits about it in popular media or in the movies or something like that, but it's not something that's really commonly discussed. So I wanted to put it out there and talk about it. So with that in mind, I'm not going to cover everything in this video. If you're watching this video and you have more questions about stuff, or you want me to touch on things more specifically, then reach out to me on social media, and you can find the links to my social media accounts in the description to this video. But to kick things off, what is PTSD? PTSD is something that's been around for a long time, and in terms of how it's been known, it hasn't always been known as PTSD. It used to be called shell shock, it used to be called combat fatigue, but even before the days of World War I, when people really started paying attention to it after a lot of veterans were coming back and they were having a lot of problems adjusting. It doesn't only affect people who are soldiers, right? PTSD, I think the first recorded cases of PTSD actually occurred with people who worked on the trains, with people getting hit by trains. And so that's when they realized that, if you witness, a trauma, you witness a death, you're not okay right afterwards. People had to start taking time off work, for experiencing stuff like that, etc. And then, but with soldiers, especially because of World War I, we started to realize how big of a problem it actually was, and it started to get a lot more attention. But a lot of people who experience PTSD, that can be through things like car crashes, it can be through mass shootings, sexual assault, so it's not just people who were in combat. It's not just soldiers. So anyways, how do we define PTSD? I'll tell you guys a little bit about what that looks like. I'm going to save it for another video to really go into detail about this stuff, so I can talk to you guys more specifically about what my experience was, and also what a more complete list of the host of symptoms look like. But to give you guys a quick breakdown, how do you get PTSD? You get PTSD by having a direct or indirect exposure to death, serious bodily injury, or sexual assault. And that can happen to you directly or indirectly. So if you're a police officer and you're reading case files about horrible things that are happening to people, you can get PTSD from that. If you were in a car crash, if you saw someone die right in front of you, if you had the fear, a very intense fear of death in a moment, and that sticks with you, for a long time after that, then you can get PTSD from those things. And after you experience a trauma like that, directly or indirectly, then there are a host of symptoms that have to come up. In order for it to really qualify as post-traumatic stress disorder, I'll go through the list, but there are two things that really stand out that are important. The first thing is that your symptoms have to last for more than 6 months after the event. Right? You experience a trauma, and then for after 6 months, you're still experiencing those symptoms, then that's one important qualifier. Another thing is that it has to be actually distressing, right? It has to disrupt your regular life. And so if there's a lot of things that you can't do anymore, you won't do anymore, I'll go into the list. But if you're having a lot of problems, you're not able to adjust, you go back to the normal way that you were living your life, or if there's so much disruption, like you can't go shopping anymore, not enjoying time with your family, constant nightmares, disturbed sleep, things like that. That's not normal. It shouldn't last that long. And so that's another qualifier for PTSD. Okay, so symptoms have to include intrusive symptoms. So that would be things like having flashbacks or having nightmares. Avoidance behaviors. So I have triggers, and I do just about everything that I can to avoid those triggers. So that's avoiding, like, I don't talk about my time in the military, certain movies I don't watch, going public places I really desperately try to avoid, things like that. Like anything that I can do to avoid my triggers, I will do that. So avoidance behaviors are really important. Your mood is affected. So this is things like your incredibly high irritability, right? Or major depressive disorder is something that also comes with PTSD quite regularly. It's very common. Things like that. So next thing is alterations in arousal. So I used to have fun going to theme parks, and then after I experienced this trauma, there's just nothing excites me anymore. All the things that I used to do that were fun are not fun. I don't look forward to things anymore, whatever it is. And then the last thing is that what are any of these symptoms in these categories that I read off right now? It can't be due to any other illness or any kind of medication or anything like that. Like it has to be due to your trauma. So that's what PTSD is, and I'll talk more in detail about those things in I think the video that I do after this one. How common is this? The most recent statistic that I read about prevalence of PTSD amongst combat veterans is that it can be, some studies have shown like it's about 13% of combat veterans, and some studies have shown as high as 20% of combat veterans have PTSD. So that's, a fairly significant number. I think of that in terms of, especially like in terms of infantrymen in general. Like, I know when I was in the military, they used to tell us that 1 in 25 soldiers was an infantryman. And so like that sounds about right to me. It's like, okay, about 20%. So it's not like every single person who goes on a deployment, gets PTSD, and it's not every single person who sees combat gets PTSD. It's fairly common. Like, of all the people that I still talk to from my time in the military, I don't know anybody who doesn't still have symptoms, from their time in combat. But like my group that I went over on both of my deployments, my group, we had a very difficult time on both of our deployments. So it's like, I can understand that. But not every unit that goes overseas sees very intense combat. Question is, since I'm talking about prevalence, acute stress disorder, and I'll talk about this in a second, but I found some statistics for acute stress disorder, which is basically PTSD, but you have it for less than 6 months. It'd be acute stress disorder. So for car accidents, people who are in car accidents, the prevalence there is it's estimated that between 13 and 21% of people who are in serious car accidents have acute stress disorder that can also lead to PTSD if the symptoms persist for more than 6 months. And then survivors of sexual assault and mass shootings, that is an estimated 20 to 50% of people who experience those two things. will have acute stress disorder. So, and that, again, like if it persists more than 6 months, then it qualifies as PTSD if you have, all the symptoms. So, just some facts out there for you guys. Okay, so question that I got was, how did I know that I had PTSD, right? And so, it was pretty simple. It actually felt kind of obvious in the beginning, because my first deployment was to Iraq, and then I had a couple experiences in Iraq that really, really stuck with me during my deployment, and they still stick with me today too. But during my deployment, like pretty quickly after they happened, I started to realize that I was not okay. To give you guys an example, I was in Iraq 3 months. I was in Iraq 3 months, and then my mom passed away. So I went back to the States, went to the funeral, and then I came back. And when I came back to Iraq, we had moved, we changed bases. So I was stationed in Baghdad when I got back to Iraq. And then when I was in Baghdad, my truck got blown up by an RPG. And, sparing you guys the significant details, I will say that moment of realizing what was happening right before the explosion went off, because I saw the RPG get fired from a distance, and it was like a split second later that it blasted through the windshield. But that moment, like seeing that flash, the impact, the sound, the smoke filling the cabin of my Humvee, the smell in the air, the sounds of people in pain and screaming afterwards, and then getting out and getting out of the truck, and the things that happened after that, it stuck with me for a long time. And with it, after, I don't know, I didn't really think too much about it in the beginning. I didn't really talk about it at all. Some people, everybody knew that it happened, and they knew everybody in the truck that it happened to. And so it's you try to make light of it, and, try to reassure the people who are there that it's going to be okay, and that it's fine, and this happens, and you're okay. But, I was not okay. I don't know how quickly it started, but if I smelled anything burning, if I saw fire, if I was walking outside at nighttime and a light on top of above a door turned on, if anything smelled like that sulfur smell of when the cabin filled up with the smoke, anything like that happened, then I started having flashbacks. Just sitting in that car and in the city of the Humvee, and getting blown up. And that's when I started to realize, I was okay, this is going to turn into a really big problem later on if I don't try to get in front of this. So it's I tried, I didn't really talk about it to anybody. It's not something that I still talk about. I used to try to joke about it and stuff for a while, or just pretend that I was okay. But that was one thing that happened pretty early on in my first deployment, where I started to realize, okay, I'm having some symptoms here that I definitely didn't have before. And then throughout the rest of the deployment, more stuff started happening, because I was experiencing other things and seeing a lot more death and violence, and the threat of violence as well, right? Of oh man, I almost died. That happened to me a ton. And during the deployment, I was I didn't know what to think about it, right? I had a couple different reactions throughout my first deployment, but, it's just I was this one person before I left to Iraq, and then suddenly, I'm having all these symptoms come up. And it turned into a catch-22. And if you guys, usually when people hear that phrase, a catch-22, you don't really know what that means or where that's from. So to explain that, Catch-22 was a book once upon a time. And it's about this guy who worked on a bomber like this, like a B-52 or something like that. And if you flew those planes, if you flew one of these bombers, your chance of survival was incredibly low, right? It was like the mortality rate was something like 90% or something. So like all of these pilots were getting just shot out of the sky, or they're getting killed on their missions. So there's this guy who's operating one of these aircraft during the war, and he's terrified that he's going to die. He's terrified. And he's like, I'm going crazy. I'm sure I'm going to die. It's going to happen any day now. And everybody who says, you know, you're not crazy. This is a normal reaction, right? If you, like, of course you think you're going to die, because lots of people die doing this. If you didn't think you were going to die, then something would be wrong. So I said, yes, you're terrified, but like that's a normal response. It's normal. It's normal to think that you're gonna die doing something that's dangerous. So you're fine, all right? You're good. Go back to work, right? And so, yeah, so that's like something like that happened to me, right? Of like I started having all these symptoms, and then they're coming back, and then, you know, we got a couple safety briefings and things for right when we came back from our deployment. I was a couple of times saw psychologists on base, and they said the same thing. They're like, hey, this is normal, right? A lot of stuff that you're going through, like anybody who went through your experience would go through this, and just give it time. They said, you're just stressed out, that's all it is. So one time I did see a psychologist on base, and they said it's acute stress disorder, right? And I talked to you guys about that, right? So those PTSD symptoms were for less than 6 months. But at this point, I'd been having symptoms for over a year, but they didn't really pay any attention to that, because I just had recently got back from my deployment. So I said, okay, it's acute stress disorder. This happens to everybody. If you're not sleeping, if you're having nightmares, if you're waking up or having a hard time going to sleep, if a lot of things that you thought were fun are suddenly not fun anymore, if you're more irritable, if you have depression, if you're overeating, which I was at the time for my first deployment, or if you're undereating, then, you know, this happens, right? Just give it some time. You just need to wind down, and it's gonna be fine, right? But how long is this supposed to last, right? And that's the next question is, you know, okay, I started having symptoms pretty early on in my first deployment, and then I get back from my deployment and I'm still having symptoms. 6 months later, I'm still having symptoms. The year after that, I'm in Afghanistan, and then yeah, I'm still having symptoms, but it felt a lot more normal, because that's the environment that where those behaviors are adaptive, right? I shouldn't really be sleeping very heavily. I should be like hypervigilant. You know, I should be looking out for these cues of danger that kept me alive, or you know, there are lessons that I learned by narrowly escaping death previously. Right? It was more adaptive in that environment, so it didn't seem as dysfunctional at that time, right? Then I go through a year in Afghanistan, and then I get home, and then it's the same thing all over again. Seeing people of like, hey, I don't think I'm okay, what's going on? Oh, it's just acute stress, it happens to everybody, you're gonna be fine, just give it time. And, you know, suffice it to say, right, it's been 13 years since my first deployment to Iraq, and it's still here. So how long is it supposed to last, right? Yeah. So when like I said, when I first started having these symptoms, I suspected it was PTSD pretty early on, because it was not normal and it was so extreme, the amount of impairment that I was having. When I got back from my first deployment, you know, again, like a lot of avoidance behaviors, and, you know, the sleep disturbances and flashbacks and intrusive thoughts and things like that. My mood was totally different. And this happened to tons and tons of people, because the group of guys that I deployed with had a very difficult first deployment, and a lot of them had a very difficult second deployment as well. When I got out of the military, then that's when it started to get a little, sketchy, where I was like, okay, I want to go, I need to go to the, order the Purple Heart and apply for disability, and if there's anything wrong with me, you know, I gotta let these guys know, and then I'll get checked out. and they asked me, they're like, do you have PTSD? And I didn't want to believe it, right? I did not want to believe it. And I thought about it, and I'm thinking about the absolute worst case scenario of people that I know who saw way more stuff than me, people who have the substance abuse disorders or alcohol use disorder, people who are, having like the super, like almost manic episodes, like with their aggression. They're, getting into fist fights and screaming matches with just random people for nothing, no reason at all. And I'm thinking, like, like, that was how I qualified it. Like, if I'm gonna tell anyone that I have PTSD, right? For me, like, I would only think that I had it if I was on the absolute extreme end of severity, right? But like, and I didn't want to accept that. And I still had that tape playing in my mind from when I saw these psychologists saying it's gonna be okay. And I thought, you know what, maybe I should give it more time. I just got out of the military, I just got married, I just moved to a new state. Maybe I will be okay. This sun is like coming through, and hold on, let me, second, oh, okay, it's fine, I'll leave it. There we go, hey, fix it. All right, so, yeah, I thought it was gonna be okay. I thought, you know what, I'm not gonna say anything right now, I'll just give it some more time, and we'll see what happens, right? Yeah, and then I ran with that for as long as I possibly could, and then I started having more and more and more disruptions, to my normal functioning. And because like I was the only, like, suddenly, like, there's no veterans around me anymore after I separated from the Army. There's nobody to talk to, there's no frame of reference for what is normal coming away from the military, much less coming away from combat. And I didn't really have the perspective that I have now of how drastically all of my relationships were being affected, in terms of, like I'm not happy to see anyone anymore. I'm isolating myself. Nothing is fun anymore. I can't empathize with people. My irritability, things like that. And then anxiety attacks. I started having panic attacks pretty regularly. And that's like, in those situations, thinking about them afterwards, I realized like what events those were attached to, right? And it's just like, I wish I got help a lot sooner, right? As I think back about it. But so like some of the things that I experienced, at least in the very early days of getting PTSD, are things like hypervigilance, sleep disturbances, my mood is being affected, so it's low affect or no affect, memory loss, which is like something that I told the VA about, like Veterans Affairs, saying like, what's going on with my memory loss? Everybody kept saying it's stress. I saw a speech pathologist who said that I'm probably just not hearing things properly. Maybe I have some low-grade hearing loss, which I do, but they're saying like, basically I'm just not paying attention and I need new strategies to help me remember things more effectively. And if they, without trying to consider this notion that I had PTSD, all this stuff didn't really make sense, right? It didn't make sense why I was still so stressed out. It didn't make sense that like suddenly memory loss is a problem, like, or like my, I can't focus properly. It's difficult for me to follow like complex instructions. Like, doesn't matter what it is, it's like, it doesn't make sense, right? Like, once you say, hey, you have PTSD and this is something that happens, it makes a lot more sense when you put it in that context. But if you just think of like all these symptoms that I'm having are just a standalone thing of stress, or, like I have a lot on my mind and I'm perpetually distracted, or, I'm in a very new environment that I haven't adjusted to yet, so, I'm not really hearing things the way that everybody else is hearing them, or I'm not paying attention to the same degree for whatever reason. Those explanations didn't really hold up, and unfortunately, all of the interventions that I was given to help me improve my memory or my concentration, or to de-stress, or to self-regulate because of my breathing or my mood or my panic attacks, those things didn't last, right? It would help me a little bit for a short time, but again, it's been more than 10 years now, and these symptoms aren't going away. But yeah, so I guess this kind of like a good place to end it here is talking about like the need to get help. Like I really dragged my feet on getting help, partly because I didn't feel like I deserved the help, right? I thought that, number one, like I had no perspective on how bad my symptoms actually were. And so I didn't think they were extreme enough for me. They were not extreme enough. But yeah, I mean, if you look at all the people who, aren't in my life anymore because I'm not investing in those relationships, if you're looking at all the stress that it's put, on my life, and a lot of my avoidance behaviors, or how poor my quality of life has been, or depressed mood, or things like that. Yeah, it was bad. You're right, and I couldn't see how bad it was in the beginning, which is part of why I didn't get help. Another reason why I didn't want to get help, like in the beginning, well, like until recently for PTSD, was because this part of my life of being in the military, and granted, this happened when I was pretty young, right? Like I joined the military when I was 18. And in those early years of like, this is like the beginning of my adult life. And it had a huge effect on me in more ways than, I care to explain right now in this video. But this part of my life, which is a major part of my life, and who I am today is all predicated on my experience in the military. And I really wanted to fight, to see the good in people, to always try to be an optimist and to see the better side of things. And in doing that, I wasn't really admitting to myself that I was not okay. And I kept trying to blow it off, or saying like, I just need more of something else, and then, you'll see it's gonna be fine. And like, I didn't really want to accept that I went through this part of my life, which to me was very important and very powerful and had a lot of positive impacts. And I didn't want to say that, I didn't want to admit to myself that I came out of this experience broken, right? I didn't want to think about all the bad things that I saw. I didn't want to think about, the incredible stress that I was under, or how poorly adjusted I am to civilian life coming out of these events. And so, I had a friend that I was talking to recently, and he summed up this feeling for me pretty well. And he said that, he had the same thing, and he said that the way he described, he says, I didn't want to admit that they got me, right? The Army, right? They got me. Like they took me into the situation, and I'm broken now, and it's not my fault, right? They did this to me. And soldiers tend to have a really hard time with this, like where you don't want to be out of the fight. And you don't want other people to suffer when you're going through a hard time. You'd much rather suffer alone. And you don't want to be a burden to other people. You want to be there for the team as much as you can, and you don't want anything to get in the way of that, right? And so it's like, I think especially amongst veterans, there's sort of this kind of fear of not being at your best and needing to fake it till you make it, and being highly dysfunctional and not really addressing that for a number of reasons, whether that's because of peer pressure, or because that's expectations for your work or from the leadership, or suggestions that you're getting just from the military culture, things like that, of like, you just gotta suck it up, and this is any behavior that's adaptive in combat is a good behavior, right? So yeah, in terms of getting help, I really dragged my feet for a really long time, and it's had a huge negative impact on myself and on my family and on all of my relationships, and in every single part of my life. So yeah, I guess I'll talk more about that stuff in the next video that I do on this. I'm already come up to half an hour with this video. But it's important, it's really important. I wish that I had a little bit more preparation, I think, for getting out of the military, of like people telling me what to expect, especially coming away from combat. But again, like I didn't I didn't know any fellow soldiers who had this kind of perspective of like you're gonna experience these things, and at what point do you start getting help for this, right? I never really talked to anybody about that. I talked to a lot of people, and like from every single level of the leadership, and they're like preparing us, saying everybody's going over there, and not everybody's coming back, and not everybody's coming back the same, and whatever it is. And I had the privilege of being trained by people who already had 1 or 2 deployments before, like when I was still fresh into the Army. And like the things that they taught me was invaluable. Definitely I'm sure it saved my life. And like just hearing their stories about how they adapted to their experience in combat, and some of those were much more extreme than anything that I saw or directly experienced. And so, I don't know, like, it's tricky, right? It's tricky, but I do wish that I had somebody there to tell me it's okay to not be okay. And, yeah, of course, you're gonna have the memory loss and the poor concentration, and the mood is gonna be affected, and the sleep disturbances, and the paranoia, and, all this kind of stuff. Like, yeah, that's gonna happen, right? But at some point, like, you need to start addressing that, and to get help. And when I was getting out of the military, that was not anything that ever really stuck with me, right? When I was getting out of the military, the things that stuck with me about the kind of briefings that I was getting out of the military was how we weren't going to make it, and we need to just give up hope and stay in the military because life is better that way. And unfortunately, like there is an air of truth to that, right? And that's what's really, really sad. It's like, it's really unfortunate. I have to talk about that another time though. But if I wish I had more training on what to expect, more resources of like, more encouragement, I guess, to get help getting out of the military and directly after, and maybe an advocate, I guess, is what I needed. I think that's what I'm trying to say. I needed an advocate to really help me get to this next step of finally getting help. And I'm really glad that I did eventually get help. And there's a lot of organizations in the U.S. and Canada. Like, yeah, I was in the U.S. Army, but I live in Canada now. And there are a lot of really amazing resources out there for people living with trauma, or living with someone in your family or in your household that has trauma, to help you guys learn to communicate and to recognize your symptoms and to manage those symptoms, or overcome those symptoms, right? And so, yeah, I also want to recognize that a lot of the newer techniques for helping people with PTSD, they weren't, I don't think that they were as well known or as well understood during the time of my first deployment as they are now, right? Or even like by the time I was out of the military, right? So it's, there was some stuff going on that was like being studied. There are, techniques for working with people with trauma that were being studied a lot more rigorously, because of all the people coming out of Iraq and Afghanistan, those OIF and OAF that had PTSD and that were seeking that help and stuff. So, but anyways, it is what it is. So yeah, it's important to get help. If you're watching this video and you were in the military and you haven't taken that steps to get yourself checked out, like, I'll tell you, just like me having a diagnosis or me having gone to programs where, I'm learning more about myself and more about my trauma and gaining perspective and understanding my symptoms and my situation a lot more. It's been a blessing that's, changed my life so far. And if you know people who are veterans or you're living with them, it's important to support them, right? Don't blow it off. the symptoms that they're having, the kind of distress that they live with every day. Don't blow it off. Encourage them, support them, give them that space to mourn and to want to come forward and look for help. And sometimes it's like not taking no for an answer. You know, it's just like, someone told me I was gonna be fine. They didn't tell me to come back if it did get better, right? But now I know, right? Now it's my job, you know, my responsibility, I feel, to help encourage people, to tell people, yeah, it's okay to not be okay, because that's a step that you take in investing in yourself of like, okay, now I need to get better. How else am I gonna, like, I'll have no initiative to get better if I don't think that I'm not okay, right? So in any case, I'm gonna end this video here. I still wanna talk more about transitioning out of the military and what that was like. And I wanna talk more specifically about the kind of symptoms that, you know, I've been living with my PTSD and what that looks like and how that affects my relationships and people in my life. And I'm still taking questions from people who are contacting me on social media, who might want to know a little bit more about my journey with PTSD and what that's been like. And why do you need to know, right? Why is that important? So more of that to come, but for right now, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will talk to you guys very soon.